Hello, everyone, and I hope you're all doing well. My name is Tanner Dagenais, and I'm the host of Self-Sabotage Solutions. Today, I'm very grateful and very thankful to have Dr. Carrie. She is a psychologist who turned into a speaker and author. She works with teams, associations, corporate audiences, and dedicated individuals. She essentially helps them learn how to skillfully navigate life's inevitable up and downs. What I refer to as self-sabotage. And then after 21 years in private practice, Dr. Carrie brings the latest developments in psychology with easy to implement strategies to empower change, improve communication, and decrease conflict. And then also sounds like she's a really big hiker, and she's really into baking. Has some delicious muffins. Sounds like so excited to hear about your hiking adventures and your psychology practice, and about some of your baking as well, because my wife's a pretty big baker as well.
Today's baked good was orange chocolate chip scones. So
wow, that's unique. I've never heard of that before. Orange chocolate chip scones. How were they?
They were delicious. The trick
Yeah.
is to take the peel of the orange and you zest it and put it in there, and it just sort of infuses flavor in. It's yummy.
Yeah, that sounds delicious. That does sound very good.
So
Great. And you're in Colorado, right?
I am in Colorado, and it's beautiful here today, which is really nice.
Yeah. What part of Colorado are you in again?
My practice is out just outside of Denver.
Okay, perfect.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was down in Parker, so just south of Denver for a while. Then we ended up moving out. So today, we're gonna be talking about your psychology practice, but I I feel like everyone who kind of gets into the work of helping other people, right? They always have their own story of like what got them into it, like what made them want to help people, and like maybe like what was their own struggles. Are you able to you want to share some of that as well, so we can kind of hear how you got into the helping others?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I decided to become a psychologist when I was 14,
Wow.
which seems like a really young age to figure that out. I was volunteering as a therapeutic horseback riding sidewalker. So if you imagine that you have the horse in the middle and there's a person on one side, on the other side, and then there's a person leading the horse. And we were working with profoundly physical disabled kids, and we had a kiddo on our horse who was nonverbal. He could not speak at all, but he had facial expressions, and you could tell that this was the highlight of his week. He loved being on the horses.
Right.
And our horses were really well trained, and they were wonderful. And he had a seizure on the horse.
Wow.
And fell off the horse, and I got to essentially catch him and get him back up right well enough that we could get him over to safety. And when his mom came, she was like, "Oh my gosh, I forgot his meds." And in my 14-year-old, like rigid little thinking brain that had no idea about running a full life, I was like, it's the most important thing in the world. Why would you have forgotten his meds? Right. And now as an adult, I recognize like, oh my gosh, piece of cake. How didn't you forget his meds more often? But at that time, it was just ignited this fire in me that I wanted to help people, particularly who might have a hard time helping themselves. And that foundational value has stayed with me the whole time. And I am now 21 years into private practice.
Wow, that's awesome. So after you had that experience, right, so you went to school then, obviously, for that?
So I went to college, but I had decided I would either be a social justice lawyer or I'd be a psychologist. So I go to college, and the psychology department was horrendous at my college. And the history department was really amazing. And so I majored in history, and I was like, I'm going to be a lawyer. And then I graduated from college, and I went to work for a law firm and recognized that it was the absolute world's worst job for me. Right.
Right.
No shade. I'm not throwing
Yeah.
shade on the entire profession. But for me, it was terrible. I was literally moving boxes of papers around, and I was filing things, and I was working with paper, and I was drowning in regret of my choice because all I wanted to do was actually help people.
Yeah.
So I moved home, went back to school, and got prerequisites so that I'd be able to apply to graduate school, and moved to Denver to get my master's at the University of Denver, and then realized how incredibly cool it is out here and refused to move back to the East Coast.
Yeah, Colorado's pretty awesome, that's for sure.
Colorado's pretty awesome. So
Yeah, that's so cool. That's an awesome story. I've definitely heard about like the horseback riding like therapy before. But that's awesome that you got into that at such a young age, and then you knew what you wanted to do even at that age.
it was, I'm aware that that's very unusual. And it was interesting to choose the path, know the path, back up and do something different, and then choose the path again, which I thought was pretty neat.
Yeah, it was like, well, actually that was the right path, the original choice.
Right. Yeah.
That's awesome. So now you're using that, and now you're work with people with like the psychology practice. So what does that really look like as far as like when you're helping people? Is it like talking about like why they're acting the way they are, like talking about like why their thoughts are the way they are? Is that what does that look that it is?
Absolutely. And my practice specializes in treating anxiety and trauma. And a huge piece of recovering from trauma is returning to belief in yourself.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, our brains do some things that our sweet brains, our sweet protective brains, are trying just to keep us safe. But interestingly, a lot of times the things that we do to keep ourselves safe actually prevents us from living a really enjoyable and full life. So this topic of self-sabotage,
Yep.
essentially we end up sabotaging ourselves because we're afraid, right?
Mhm.
We're afraid we're going to fail. Worse, you're afraid you're going to succeed. Right? This is the fun thing about
Yep.
self-sabotage. It's like you'll sabotage yourself because you're afraid to fail. And then as soon as you start succeeding, then your self-sabotaging behaviors will be like, wait, I have something for this too.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so for like all the listeners out there, I'm sure they're curious, like why would you self-sabotage when you're, gonna be succeeding? I'm sure people are like, well, like I know people understand like when you're scared, but what is it when you're succeeding?
Well, so there's dual fears. So the fear of failure is about wanting to avoid shame, and the fear of not living up to somebody else's expectations. Interestingly, the fear of success is about responsibility and pressure. Have you ever, and you might have experienced this, if you meet somebody and you're dating them, and somebody asks when you're going to get serious, right?
Right.
And then once you get serious, then they ask when you're going to get engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get engaged, they ask when you're going to get married. When you get married, then they ask when you're going to have kids. And we don't stop there. As soon as you have your first kid, people start asking when you're going to have another one.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, it's sort of a funny example, but it's an example of the never ending pressure that we aren't afraid to talk to each other about, right? Like we aren't afraid to pile it on people. Instead of letting people enjoy where they are in the present moment, we're constantly asking them where their expansion is going to be. And sometimes expansion is really fun. I'm a fan of expansion. But sometimes it's actually really fantastic to enjoy where you're at. And so the notion of success is that if you succeed, then inevitably there's going to be this expectation from other people and this pressure and this next step that you have to take, right? Like anytime your brain gets into the have tos, you can probably know that you're likely to not be making the best choices because you feel like you're obliged to move in a certain direction instead of choosing to move in a certain direction.
Yep. Yeah, that makes total sense, and I've definitely experienced some of that in my own life before. But I mean, on your point of like being able to be happy with what you have now and like what you've succeeded in, just like the present moment, I feel like that's so important, because if you're always just looking forward for like that future success, that future material object to be happy, then you're always going to need something new, right? You're going to get that
Correct.
short satisfaction, and then you're like, well, what's next to make myself happy, right? Instead of just being happy with what you have now. So I think that's so important.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually sometimes why people sabotage is secretly they might not want to do the next thing. And so this is really important when you're taking a look at a pattern of self-sabotage, or if you suspect that that's what you're in. It's important to sort of dial it down and figure out what exactly is it that's causing the problem, right? Are you trying to avoid something because you're worried it won't be good enough? Or are you trying to avoid something because you don't actually want to do it? Two very different answers and two very different behavior patterns that you're going to want to come up with. If you're avoiding something because you're afraid of it, right? Like I use the example, I like to pick on myself, right? Instead of anybody else. I use the example of I wrote a book, I got it published last year. And this is fantastic, right? I love my book. I'm very excited about it. It sort of encapsulates my philosophy. It's called Self-Help on the Go. Really love it. And you might think, since I had written a book, that I'm good at writing. Writing is brutal. You should see me when I have to write my blog post for the month. I have to get motivated, and then I have to figure out what the subject is. And then I have to clean my kitchen. And the next thing I know, I'm reorganizing my closet and I'm doing anything except sitting at my computer and writing.
Yep.
And so I now know enough about my particular, and this is the other thing about self-sabotage. We often self-sabotage in ways that are reasonably predictable, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Like my procrastination self-sabotage habit about something like writing is it's internal pressure inside my own head of how good something needs to be. And then I get stressed about it. And then I get snacky, right? So then I have to visit the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I decide that I need to organize something. And in the past, when I wasn't as clear and honest with myself about what my pattern was, I could get lost in that for too long of a period of time. Now I can actually structure it, right? It's like, oh, you need to write your blog post today. So let's grab a snack and sit at your desk, and then give myself a time period to clean something up and then get started, right? So like knowing what the pattern is then gives you power to decide what percentage of the pattern are you going to indulge, and what percentage of the pattern are you going to be like, yeah, no, we're not going to let it go that far.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, I feel like definitely identifying your the pattern of self-sabotage and like what you do is so important. Like just being consciously aware of like your own like habits and like what you would actually go through every time. Because there's definitely like we have those routines built into us, like little like programs, right? Um, and that definitely creates a. But it's interesting how you were talking about like you actually take some of those like habits, it's like some of your routine and structure it into it. So like you already have it set up. So because you know you're going to be wanting to get a little snack, you know you're going to be wanting to clean. You have that actually built into it as a. So that's one of your techniques. Then you help people do when you're working with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, and figure out what the self-sabotaging pattern is that you have. Like mine, I'm a heavy procrastinator, self-sabotager,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Other people might get heavy into ambivalence, where they just end up feeling stuck between multiple options. Other people might have a really strong negative inner critic, and they start talking to themselves in a super nasty voice. Other folks lean on addiction, right? Like whatever your self-sabotage is, it's probably reasonably predictable because you've likely done it before, right? And you might have different self-sabotaging patterns in different scenarios, right?
Yep.
And so understanding when does a certain pattern show up, and then acknowledging that the pattern is real. Once you've acknowledged reality, you have so many more options. You have so much more choice over what you want to do about the reality, because you're no longer fighting against reality, which is its own, that's its own dynamic. If you accept reality, whether or not you like it, like this is the key point. People think that accepting reality means that you approve of it or you like it.
Yep.
No, acceptance of reality literally just means like factually stating, here I am, and teasing the judgment part out of it, right? Like, here I am, full stop, instead of here I am and it's good, or here I am and it's bad. And identifying what's going on. But most of the time we self-sabotage when we feel uncomfortable, right? And so noticing, oh, I feel uncomfortable. Okay. Is there a way? And then asking yourself the question, like, is there a way to get more comfortable right now? Sometimes the answer is no, right? I have yet to make writing, particularly starting writing. Once I'm into writing, sometimes I can get into flow and it's really wonderful. But for me, the act of starting writing, I've yet to have that be comfortable. And I used to want to wait until I felt comfortable to start. And this is a critical error that we make as humans. Waiting until you're comfortable, you're doomed. If you're doing something new or hard or different, you are de facto not going to feel comfortable. And that, recognizing that, gives you so much freedom, because then you're not trying to force something that's never going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, that's a big part of self-sabotage, right? Like avoiding the comfortability, or avoiding getting uncomfortable.
Yep.
We just get so used to staying in our same routine, our day after day, go to work all day, come home, open some Coca-Cola, some bag of Doritos, right? Watch some TV all night.
Yep.
And then just kind of stay in that same routine, and nothing really changes.
Right.
And then, yeah, I mean, that's totally correct. I mean, then you start going after those hard situations, like, whoa, I don't know about this, I mean, and then brings you back to the point of the failure, or the fear of failure, right? Like, fear is definitely one of the major factors, like, I have found in my own life and with the people I work with as well. Like, just fear, whether it's rational or not, right? Like, there's so many different fears that there are, and it really does affect your brain on like a big level. So I'm curious, so like with your schooling, what how does fear affect our brain? And
Well, fear is really interesting, and there's sort of a continuum of different things on the fear spectrum, right? Ranging from, oh gosh, I walked into my garage this morning and almost stepped on a vole. Garage had been open all day yesterday, and this little rodent had gotten into my garage, right? Not a mouse, not a rat. We'd really not be down with rats. You live in Colorado, you're going to have like mice, or occasionally you're going to see them. But this little vole, he's a little springtime, chubby little guy. And I screamed because I literally almost stepped on him. And I'm not sure who was more scared, me or him, but I opened the door and suddenly there's this thing and I'm like, ah, right? And that's that instinctual fear. And then almost immediately it dissipated. Oh, it's a vole. Look at how cute he is. Oh shit, buddy. You're in the wrong place. You don't belong in the garage. Let's get you out of the garage. So the fear just eliminates and is fast. The fear that we then attach to a story that then builds, that becomes fear that's harder to get away from. It doesn't release as easily, right?
right.
So if the story was, we often tell ourselves social stories, right? Like, I was working with a client the other day who's having a hard time going to things like a cocktail party. And now that COVID is done, things like those sorts of expectations are back on this person's plate. And it's like, well, I'm going to go and I'm not going to fit in, and I don't know what to talk about, and I'm terrible at small talk, right? Like, so notice, like, all of this building stories all of a sudden turns a cocktail party, which is just a cocktail party, right? Like, you go, you drink alcohol, you don't drink alcohol, you say hello to people, you eat the snacks, you decide not to eat the snacks, like whatever. Like, it's actually a setup that you probably actually know how to do. But for this person, because they have gotten so many of those deep, dark stories in their head, it feels like they're walking into a hurricane, right? Instead of walking into a room where probably at least 40% of the people in the room feel the exact same way that this person does, and just walking up to somebody and saying hello, or going over to the food table and grabbing a snack and deciding whether or not they like the food or not, right? Like they have options to take the fear and settle it down, but it's very difficult to do when the fear has then gotten attached to all of the stories of meaning, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's all about like your thoughts, right? Like
Yes.
what you think about really does matter. And
Yes.
I don't think a lot of people realize just how like sure like they probably heard, oh, like what you think about matters. They don't really fully understand like
No, it
just
really
what it
matters.
does. Yeah. So like I have a couple different like messages around my room, like one beyond my
I
whiteboard,
see
I'm enough.
one.
And that
Yep.
one's always been really powerful for me because, you know, I feel like that's a really big thing in our society where people just don't feel like they're enough. It's like
Yep.
currently how they are. And so you know, I had a lot of negative thinking. Actually, one of my major negative thinking was like public speaking. You know, like in
Hmm.
front of classes, I'd always be like the kid who was shaking, like sweating and like
Yep.
stuttering, and so I definitely had to make a lot of changes and overcome those negative thoughts to get to where I am. And once I did, I realized it's not really that bad.
Right.
Like
It's
it's
just people,
mm-hmm,
right?
yeah,
And I think one of the things that is really helpful is to embrace what your actual strengths and weaknesses are. So
mm-hmm,
if you work with me or spend, more than a few minutes talking to me, I'm always going to be wanting you to do a couple of basic things. Number one is like understand what your foundational values are.
mm-hmm,
Once you understand those, then you have a lot of power in making choices that align with those values,
right,
right? And then, so knowing your values, understanding what your choices are, and then also just getting honest about what your strengths and weaknesses are and actually embracing them. So, for example, using the client who was worried about small talk, it was like, what you can embrace that you don't know how to do small talk.
right,
And then you could read a book about it. You could go and practice it. We could try this role play. We could do, right? Like all of a sudden, as soon as she was able to embrace, like, hey, this isn't my strong point, then she had this myriad of options that opened up to her. But trying to push away your weaknesses or to not own your strengths keeps you in a very small world, because then you're spending all of your time and energy deflecting against people getting to know you instead of essentially saying, yeah, that's a weakness of mine,
yep,
right? Because again, like just accepting reality, then nobody has a button to push. You've already showed them the button,
mm,
right? And then the button's disconnected. And then you have options to decide, like, hey, I'm not great. Let's take the small talk example. Hey, I'm not great at small talk. Do I feel like learning how to do that better or not? Then again, you even have a choice there, right? So increasing options and choices based on empowering yourself going to be the foundational thing that you're going to get with me.
yeah. Yeah, and I know you talked about before, just like acknowledging, you know, either the thought that came through or like just now, like acknowledging your weak spots, your strong points, like goes back just to being more consciously aware of what what is going on in your life, where you are right now, right? So for me, like when I teach my clients, I talk a lot about like the conscious and the subconscious mind. Do you
Mhm.
touch on those two parts of the mind?
Absolutely. Yeah, because we will often be three-quarters of the way into a habit that we've told ourselves, we've sworn we were
Yeah.
going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing you know, you're three-quarters of the way into the habit.
Yep.
So one of the things you want to do is to make some of those, particularly if you're looking to change habits, you want to make some of those bad habits harder to indulge, and you want
Mm-hmm.
to make the good habits easier to get to. If you ever come into my office, most of the time on the right-hand side of my desk, there will be an open container of either raspberries, or there'll be an apple there. There'll be fruits and vegetables at some level on the right-hand side of my desk. And now this is based on a concept called choice architecture, but we can do choice architecture inside our own heads with our thoughts, and then we can do it physically in our environments. I was looking at my nutrition, this was a while back, and I was like, I am eating like a bad kindergartner, right? Like,
Yep.
like I'm grabbing sugar at 3 o'clock. Like I'm eating cookies. I, can't remember the last time I had more than 5 fruits and vegetables in a day. I was like, come on, man, like you could do better. And so I tried to design a physical system so that it would be harder to reach for the things that I shouldn't necessarily be indulging in, and use those as treats instead of as everyday snacks.
Right.
And easier to indulge in the things, easier to make the good habit just right there. And I recognize that actually putting things on my desk in an open container, and then I nibble on them through the day, I've made it a game, right? Like how many fruits and vegetables can I get in a day? So then I'm in a fun competition with myself. That works for me. That doesn't always work for people. But so physically making good habits easier and physically making bad habits harder means that you've taken something that's unconscious and you've turned it into conscious, and then you have more power over it.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of like, how like your little fruit bowl. So people have like those open containers with just candy around their house.
Yes.
And every time they walk by, they see that, which reminds them, hey, it's candy time, and then they go and grab some, right? So I love the open fruit bowl, and that's something I talk about as well. Makes me think of like how nature always goes down the path of least resistance, right? And just like that, we do the same thing. So like when you were talking about like making it harder to like go down that path, made me think of like putting like a blockade like in a stream, right? And then that stream will go down a new path. And that's exactly what I think of when I hear like putting those blocks in those paths, is just creating a new path of least resistance so that you'll flow down that new path instead.
And particularly if you're looking at an overindulgence issue, like if you're trying to give up smoking or give up drinking or drink less or whatever, make it difficult to make it difficult. Right? So for my clients who are trying to give up smoking, it is interesting. There are 2 very difficult things to get clients to give up. One is abusive relationships. You just keep going back. And the second is smoking, right? Like I can help people change just about any habit. Those are the 2 hardest. But let's say you're a smoker and you always smoke in your car. Go get your car detailed and then put your cigarettes in the trunk, and then procrastinate around getting them out of the trunk. So you have an urge to smoke? Okay, I bet you do. You're trying to give up smoking. Just procrastinate around the urge. And the fascinating thing is, if you procrastinate around it for 15 or 20 minutes, which is going to feel agonizing in the beginning, oftentimes it just fades. Like whatever it is, that's this drumbeat in your head that you have to have, it just sort of fades out.
No, that's great advice. And so that drumbeat in your head, that is there, like just asking you, like urging you, like tantalizing you to say, come on, please, just have me. What part of the mind does that come from for all the listeners? Or like why does that come about?
Well, so I like to divide folks' brains into our verbal prefrontal cortexes, our emotional brains, which I call our back brain, and then our inner, it's our alligator brain. It's really located in the middle, but you point to the back of your head. And we have this idea, again, this is about safety and survival. So we are designed as humans more for survival than we are for enlightenment.
Right.
And our alligator brains in particular are scanning for threat at all times. And as soon as they see a threat, they tend to be very snappy about it. Our dogs, our inner mammal, is looking to feel comfortable and playful, tends to be reward focused, tends to be aversive to punishment, right? And then our prefrontal cortex is where we analyze and use linguistics to work through an issue. So if you're thinking about the notion of an impulse to have something, right? Our brain's bar for efficiency is very low. Whatever didn't kill you the last time you tried it, you should do again. This is part of what makes change hard, right? Is our brain's like, yeah, but you did this before and you were fine. Even if you know that long-term it's going to be a problem, right? This is why commercials, we'll pick on smoking again. This is why commercials that are trying to convince smokers to stop smoking by telling them that they're going to die from smoking doesn't work very well is because yesterday, like they had a cigarette this morning.
And
They
die.
didn't die, they were
Mhm.
fine. So their brain's like, this makes you feel better. You have to do this, right? That survival urge comes in. And then as soon as we're uncomfortable, we're sort of like a mammal spinning around in circles. And using your prefrontal cortex is to notice it feels like I'm going to die if this doesn't happen. I'm actually going to be fine. Right? Like the vole this morning in my garage. The reason I screamed is because my inner alligator was like, threat.
Mhm.
Right? And quickly I was able to be in my prefrontal cortex. I was like, it's a vole. It's literally harmless. It is a
Yep.
blind rodent, like is not going to hurt
Mhm.
you. But the inner alligator, the first inner alligator thing was something unexpected moving, you're in danger. Right? So getting ourselves balancing our need for safety, for reward, and then for logic, balancing those three is quite a task that we're actually doing almost all the time. And our brain's desire for us to feel comfortable is just that. And actually, if we take a look at like the smoker's craving, you feel like you're going to die. You're actually fine. You're just uncomfortable. And again, like figuring out a healthier way to make yourself comfortable is a really great option. And sometimes determining like, oh yeah, this is an uncomfortable process. Okay. Right? Have you ever talked to somebody who wanted to give up caffeine?
Oh yeah. Yep.
And people can give up caffeine a little bit more easily, partially because they understand what the side effects are of not having caffeine. Typically, it's a headache and you're kind of grouchy.
Mhm.
And the folks who give up caffeine, or really the folks who give up anything most skillfully, are the ones who essentially say out loud, yeah, I'm giving up caffeine. I'm probably going to be a little bit grouchy and have a headache. They're in acceptance
Mhm.
of the fact that they're going to feel uncomfortable. That acceptance then gives them power to handle it when they are uncomfortable.
Yep.
Does that make sense? I feel like that was a very roundabout answer to your question.
No, that's definitely, I mean, that's definitely great. That's a great answer. So, I mean, like acknowledging that, hey, this is going to be uncomfortable, but I'm choosing it anyways. And I feel like that's like the language you're saying when you're trying to quit something, right? Because I hear a lot of people say, oh, I'm trying not to smoke. Well,
Right.
what's saying, when you're saying I'm trying, it's implying that, well, I'm probably going to fail.
Right.
Like you kind of like giving yourself that out instead of saying, I'm choosing not to smoke. Like,
Right.
it's a choice.
Or even better,
Mhm.
I'm becoming a non-smoker.
Yep. Hmm. Yep.
I'm practicing being a non-smoker.
Exactly.
And some days it's going to be really easy, and other days it's probably going to feel really hard.
Hmm.
I do think it's interesting, one of the self-sabotage patterns, like we talked about avoidance, we've talked about some of the addictions, things like that. We talked about some of the negative self-talk. One of the trickiest ones is when self-sabotage actually is passivity, where you are just not doing anything.
Yep.
And the push to do something often is coming from people outside of yourself. And then you tend to, folks who are in a very passive mindset, they feel really stuck. And it's interesting because it goes back to that old, I think it's Newtonian law of, a body in motion tends to stay in motion and a
Hmm.
body at rest tends to stay at rest. And passivity is a particularly poisonous form of self-sabotage because the passivity builds on itself.
Hmm.
So what you don't do means that there's more that you haven't done, which takes you progressively farther and farther away from what you do want to do. So
Hmm.
this is one of the things that I talk to my clients a lot about. It's like, even one step forward is better than no steps forward, even
Yep.
if it's a step forward and it feels clumsy or you haven't gotten everything figured out yet. Getting in motion is a huge piece of overcoming that passive self-sabotage. And frankly, that, if you go back to my example of procrastinating around writing,
Mhm.
getting my butt in the chair with my hands on my keyboard is actually the most important step, whether what I write is usable or not usable in that moment. It's like just getting the act of going instead of being in here stressed about what is going to happen or what isn't going to happen. Like however your brain is going, getting into action is one of the critical keys, particularly for folks who are more passive or more avoidant self-sabotagers.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean, I feel like the more you wait to do something, the more that, just like you said, it builds up and builds up. Then you're like, now I got all this other stuff to do. Now I got this, and then like there's the people just don't want to get out of bed, right? They just want to stay in
Yep.
bed all day, every day. Actually, I heard this tip. I'm not sure if you know who Mel Robbins is. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so she has the 5 second rule. Have you heard that?
Just starting something for 5 seconds.
Well, it's like it's not like the 5 second rule where you pick up food off the ground. It's not that, but it's the 5 second rule where it's like, because she tells a story of how like she was just laying in bed every day, like all day, and like she got like stuck in this rut, and she was just watching something on TV, and ended up being like a NASA like rocket takeoff, and they were counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the rocket just took off, and she
Uh-huh.
in that moment she thought, I need to be that rocket. Like when I'm feeling like I'm stuck, I just need to count down from 5 to 4, 5 to 1,
And
and then
get
just get up
moving.
and just go do it before I have time to think about everything I need to do. Just count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just go. And like imagine yourself as a rocket like blasting off, and just go do the thing. And I've practiced that a couple different times, and it's pretty powerful. It's good because I feel like it breaks that like that conscious mind thinking, kind of gets you more into your
Yep.
conscious mind, like creating a new like program, a new like new normal for you to kind of go through. So
And it's funny because we
mhm.
also are patterned in, right? Like what happens when you're driving down a street and you see a stop sign?
You stop. Well, most people do.
Right, right. There are all the like folks who do the
Yeah.
California stop, but like typically what our brains register
Mhm.
is like, oh, it's time to stop, and you pause. The 5 second rule is the opposite of that, right? We have been patterned
Mhm.
and accustomed to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One means go,
Yep.
right? Same way that a red stop sign gets us to stop.
Mhm.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One means go, one means launch. So we're building on something that's already unconsciously giving us permission to get up and go. That's a brilliant idea. I had not heard that one. I've heard the 5 minute rule where it's like
Okay.
whatever you're afraid of, just set a timer and get into it for 5 minutes and then see
Mhm.
what happens. And 99% of the time you'll spend more than 5 minutes on it. Um, but oh, I love this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 launch.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, and the 5 minute rule, that's definitely a good one too, because you're like can't get in the flow state, but actually just do it for 5 minutes, and you'll
Yep.
definitely end up doing a bit more. And like it's just about getting going, like you're saying, like just get on your computer if you want to write a
Yes.
book. You don't have to write 100 pages. You just write two
Yep.
pages, 5 pages. Just write something, and then you can always go back and see like, can I even use that, or what is it,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Um, Man, I just had something in my head. So yeah, we've been talking a lot about like different forms of self sabotage and things like that. So if someone is like deep in the self sabotage, right, and they're maybe being very negative with themselves, um, and they want to break that pattern, so like they keep having those negative thoughts, but they won't go away. Is there anything like techniques you have for people for that?
Absolutely. I love to
Mhm.
have people, again, get real with what's going on. And so to notice, like, take a step back and almost pretend that you're going to play detective in your own life,
Mhm.
right? Huh, I want X, but I keep doing Y.
Mhm.
And then to ask yourself the question, like, what's going on? Do I have a bad setup? Am I in the middle of a negative habit? Am I procrastinating? Am I afraid of something? Am I overdoing something? Is perfectionism, standing in my way? And sometimes we have the answer to why you are not doing X when you intend to do it. And sometimes it's really simple, right? Like with my fruit and vegetable habit, frankly, I had bad habits and a negative setup.
Right.
And so that's really easy to change. I can change that habit simply by changing the setup. If you are doing X, if you're not doing X and you want to be, and it's because of perfectionism, then that's where you can do a little bit more internal self-talk, right? Like, well, how about I try to get this to 80%?
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think, where the 5-minute rule is based on this same concept, right? Like,
Right.
let's get started and then let's see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
How about I get to 80%? See what I think, right? Um, if you are in a lot of fear, then you can take a look at, and you can do an assessment of, what am I really afraid of? Right? Like, do I really need to be afraid in this moment? Or can I notice the fear and do it anyway? Is this actually something dangerous? Right? Like, I never want to turn my clients away from actual fear,
Right.
right? Like, truly, it's going to help keep you safe fear.
Mm-hmm.
Please pay attention to that, right? Um, but if it's just irrational fear of worrying that it won't be good enough, or worrying that somebody won't like it, or worrying that somebody's going to be mad at you, it's like, okay, then you can notice that fear and almost imagine that you set it off to the side and then go and do what you want to do, right?
Right.
So this is where, and sometimes this is disappointing to my clients, they're like, I want my anxiety to go away, right? Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
ready, it needs to go away. I'm going to be better when it is gone. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but anxiety is an emotion. Emotions come and go. You can expect anxiety to kick up from time to time,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you tend to run anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Some folks tend to run hot tempered. They're going to need to manage anger forever, right? It's not bad. That's just their tendency. Some folks tend to run depressed. They need to manage their energy and make sure that they don't let depression make a hostile takeover. If you tend to run anxious, hate to break it to you, I'm not going to be able to get it to go all the way away. But I can help you work with it, because again, if we go back to that comment that I made earlier about embracing your strengths and weaknesses, know what your strengths and weaknesses are and understand what your tendencies are. How do you tend to respond in a certain situation, right? And once you understand those patterns, then again, you have a lot more power about what to do with them.
Right. That's a great point. And question. So the tendencies that we have, right? They tend to run anxious. They tend to run. However, where does that usually come from? Does it come from, because from my understanding and from what I usually teach a lot of my clients, and I'd love to hear your input on this, like it usually comes from like usually from things they've learned, when they were kids, between the ages of 2 and 7, a lot of the times, they've learned, they had some kind of experience, they saw their parents acting a certain way, they saw, they were bullied in school, and so they felt anxious about that, or whatever it may be, and then they just kind of kept that going for the rest of for like it became like what's safe, for them to do.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a pattern that
Mhm.
has built on things that were modeled to them or reactions that they had a long time ago. Some of it, frankly, if you've ever spent any time with babies, there's some babies that are like, right? Like they sleep and they're just easy and they're just sort of nonplussed by the world. Then there's other babies that are moving and grooving from the minute they're born, right? There's some, so some of this is like the nature versus nurture debate. There's certainly, I would say, a little bit of both.
Right.
And there's some interesting research. I can't cite anything specific just off the top of my head, but there is some interesting research about some folks who tend to run a little bit more anxious or tend to run a little bit more aggressive. We're seeing some brain chemistry differences in some of those folks and some genetic differences, that I think at some point, I don't think we have enough information yet. But my guess is at some point we'll be able to help people identify that a little bit more. But certainly things like anxiety tends to run in families. There's a genetic component to it. Depression does too. So does OCD. So it's worth taking a look at both the nature and the nurture portion of it. I think sometimes we've gotten, at the moment, it feels like we've gotten so attuned to anxiety in particular and trauma that now everything is considered a trauma.
Yeah.
Um, and that is systematically weakening our entire population, right? Like
Mhm.
we actually want to be able to handle hardship. That is a piece of being human. Things are going to get hard, and that's okay. Does not necessarily mean that anybody's out to get you. Um, I remember my daughter, this was years ago, she came home from school and she's like, I'm being bullied. And I'm like, okay, talk to me about it. Like, what's happening? And she's like, so-and-so told me she didn't like my haircut. And I was like, well, so-and-so is entitled to have an opinion, even if you don't like the opinion,
Mhm.
right? Like, so talk to me a little bit more about what happened. And it turns out that, it was one of these things where it was like, hey, do you like my haircut? No, I don't like your haircut. Oh, you're being a bully. No, ma'am.
That's not the way it works.
Like you can decide that she doesn't have very good taste and that you love your haircut and she's wrong. I was like, but that's a very different scenario than being bullied. So like I feel like one of my jobs right now is systematically helping our population be like, you've got this. You
Mhm.
have more skills than you think you do. Like you are really okay. You can do hard things. Come on.
Yeah.
Obviously without diminishing true trauma. I work a lot with major folks with major trauma histories, and that does leave a lasting negative impact. Interestingly, it can also leave a lasting impact of a desire for resilience and a capability of resilience. So the notion of putting our kids in bubbles and protecting them from everything is systematically making them weaker. There has to be a balance between, you know, Lord of the Flies and everyone being at home not able to handle anything. So there's middle ground. I'm always trying to help people get to middle ground. So
Yeah, I definitely noticed that like a lot more people are very touchy if you say something, and it's like, well, I mean, everyone can have their own opinion. Like, just because someone says something to you doesn't mean you have to accept it, right? Like, that's
right.
as a conscious individual, you like, well, what they said, I don't agree with, so I'm not gonna let that in.
Someone having a different opinion
Yep.
is not actually a lethal threat.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of these, like, I feel like we touched on fear a couple different times, right? And like a lot of these fears are like, especially in today's day and age, are really irrational, right? Like
Yes.
now that we have like food and we have shelter, and there's a lot less of that like fighting for food, and there's a lot less fighting for shelter. I mean, obviously, it still happens in our world, but I
Yep.
mean, a lot of those basic things that we would be fearful for in our lives have been kind of dealt with, and now they
Yep.
just become a lot of like irrational fears.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting, and I'd be curious.
Mhm.
I don't have the answer to this, but I'd be interested in seeing some research on it. Um, do our brains need something to chew on, to worry about? Right? Like, so if we're taking away the big existential fears, we do have food, we do have shelter, we are generally safe. Um, do our brains actually have to manufacture something then to be afraid of? Or are we systematically manufacturing fears when we don't have to? Right.
Mhm.
This is a theoretical question I don't have the answer to, but I think it is interesting because sometimes I think, particularly for folks who have a tendency to run anxious, I would put myself in that category. I don't know if you'd put yourself in that category. Um, but like if I had to pick one of the tendencies, uh, anxiety could be mine. Um, and channeling that into productive action has been very helpful to me, or channeling that into, a better understanding of what's going on or things like that has been helpful. But I wonder if our brains actually have a kind of default setting to like, everything's okay, but what if it isn't, right?
Mhm.
And to help ourselves settle down and actually really acknowledge, no, I'm looking around. Everything really is generally okay right now. I am pretty safe.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a big part of it has to do with like just societal influences as well. Because I mean, if you look at like the news, for instance, like it's just
Horrendous.
fear. It's just like fear, like 24/7, right? Like,
Yes.
and so like that's conditioning our minds. Like, what else should I be fearful of, right? I feel like that definitely has a major influence on just us in general. So, I like with those societal influences, like maybe without them, we would be, able to not be just fearful of just random things. But like, I feel like one of the biggest influences on self sabotage, at least for like a lot of like my clients, I talked a lot about this is, like the TV and
Yes.
social media and
Yep.
like those sorts of things. Cause like the technology just has such a major impact on our brains and like creating new like habits and creating new like
And
subconscious
creating
programs.
new
Yep.
storylines, right?
hmm
Like I think the storyline right now is that we should be very afraid of we should not have any confidence in our own abilities, and we should be afraid of each other.
Yep.
And the interesting thing is the more that you get out and interact with other people, like, yeah, there's always going to be a percentage of people who don't make any sense and they make
hmm
terrible decisions. But for the most part, if you slow down and actually go and talk to your neighbors, they're probably just your neighbors,
hmm
right? And they have their own sets of strengths and weaknesses, and that's okay.
Yep.
So it's interesting because social media, I think, really trips up the part of the brain that's in comparison
hmm
and keeps us stuck around that fear of failure, right? Like shame, not living up to expectations. I don't have that, but they do. Or like there's all of that kind of oppression. And then if you look at the media, in particular ads, you should be afraid of everything,
Yep.
right? And
hmm
then we make it really easy to self-sabotage. Things like Netflix plays your next episode without stopping
Oh yeah.
because that is beneficial to
hmm
them. It is not beneficial to us.
I mean, even now, like you just put like your, you just like hover over something and it'll start playing automatically. Have you
Yes.
noticed that?
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, we are
hmm
if we are not managing how we're spending our time and where we're putting our attention, we have to manage that very diligently right now because other forces are looking to manage it for us, and that is not great for us.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes me think back to when you're talking about like this part of our mind, like it seeks safety, right? To be
Yes.
safe. And
Yes.
so like often what is the most safe thing? It's going to be the most familiar thing, the thing that you've seen the most often, that you've encountered the most. And so it kind of goes back to when you're talking about like making those blocks so it's not as easy to get to that familiar thing and making
Yep.
it so something else is more familiar, like your fruit bowl that you have
Yep.
on your desk. So I love that fruit bowl. That's
I
a great
love my
idea.
fruit bowl. My fruit and vegetable consumption has skyrocketed. It's been really good.
That's awesome. And I love the idea about like making it a game. I heard
Yeah.
this other idea of making like dishes a game with like your
Uh-huh.
partner. So you have like two sticky notes on a wall, and you have your name on one of them. The other partner's name is on their sticky note.
Uh-huh.
And so whoever's sticky notes closest to the dishes has to do it. And when you do the dishes, you can move your sticky note behind the other person. And the
Uh-huh.
incentive is to making sure you do the dishes when there's not a lot of dishes. And then if you procrastinate, then you get the pile up of dishes. So
Oh, that's awesome. And
um,
and this is a piece again where if we one of the ways around self-sabotage is to systematize some of the stuff,
yep.
right? Like if you
Mhm,
hate doing the dishes, make it a game, but also like make it a system, right? Like
mhm,
whoever cooks doesn't clean up, right?
mhm,
As soon as the person's done cooking, the other person's on cleanup duty, right? Or what is your system? Maybe you make sure that all of your dishes are done before you go to bed at night so that then
mhm.
you don't wake up in the morning feeling like this is how self-sabotage plays out, right? Like
Yep.
you don't do something and then you wake up and then you have all the guilt and shame from not doing it, which then makes it harder for you to motivate to do it, which then makes the problem build. And the next thing you know, you've done this, like huge cycle.
Mhm,
And the opposite of that is making the system of, I don't go to bed unless all my dishes are done.
mhm.
And as soon as you get there, hang on, sorry, something is spontaneously turning on in my
No
computer.
problem.
Got it. But as soon as you get there, then you wake up in the morning and then you've gotten yourself steps and steps farther away from self-sabotage because you wake up in pride and gratitude for yesterday's self, right?
Yep.
Instead of frustration and guilt and shame in your current self. Yeah. So a piece of self-sabotage is asking yourself the question, like, how would my future self feel if I make this choice versus that choice?
Mhm. Yep. The long-term thinking versus the short-term thinking, right?
Yes.
Like that's a big part of self-sabotage for sure. And just kind of getting stuck in that short-term pleasure-seeking gratification and not thinking long-term. And um, so important to kind of get more into that conscious, that analytical thinking part of your mind to be able
Yes.
to go long-term. Like, okay, well, long-term, like this is my goal. If I don't
Yeah.
do this, is it going to bring me towards my goal or away from my goal? So important.
And a huge piece of getting into that thinking brain is actually acknowledging your emotional brain, right? So I think sometimes people feel like, oh, that's too logical of an approach. When I'm afraid, all I can think about is being afraid. And so it's like, if you are feeling afraid, getting into your body, where do you feel the fear?
Mm-hmm.
Is it in your chest? Is it in your, do you have butterflies in your tummy? Do your legs feel antsy? Like in getting embodied into the emotion and really actually labeling and acknowledging the emotion. And then asking, what's my next best move? That's one of my very favorite questions, right? Is you do an assessment, but the assessment isn't logic only. You're not a robot.
Mm-hmm.
It's noticing and acknowledging the emotions and almost like imagining tucking them under your arm and then looking around and doing an assessment of what else is going on here. What other options do I have? So that then whatever the strong emotion is that's hijacking you, it's not the thing that's in charge anymore, right?
Yep.
I use the joke. I actually first read this in Elizabeth Gilbert has a book. Oh my gosh, I can see the cover. What's the name of the book? I don't think it's going to come to me. But Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a book. It's a nonfiction book, and it's all about her sort of learning lessons through art. And she talks about, she has a very significant tendency to run anxious. And she talks about how she has decided that anxiety can't be driving the car, right? It needs to be in the trunk. And I talk to my clients all the time. I'm like, if anxiety is trying to make a hijack, or really any strong emotion, right? It could be as diffuse as just tension. It could be as specific as anger. It could be anxiety. If there's any strong emotion that's trying to hijack you and it's trying to drive, you want to remember that emotion's a terrible driver.
Mm-hmm.
It's impulsive, it's erratic, it's going to drive too fast, it's going to stop the car at the wrong time, and it has terrible taste in music. Right? So it needs to be in the back seat in a seatbelt, right? Because it can have something to say about where you're going, but it can't be the thing driving the car. If emotion is the thing that is guiding your choices, you are going to be making generally poor choices, right?
Yep.
It's like people who want to be happy all the time. It's not possible. Happiness is an emotion. It's going to come and it's going to go, right? You have to make room in the car for the other emotions, but you don't want any one of them to hijack you. You want you and your thinking brain to be the one driving the car.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so it's so important to like get into your body and actually feel the emotions. And
Yes.
if a negative thought, just don't reject it. Accept, like, hey, acknowledge it. Say I had that negative thought,
Yeah.
and then address it after. And I think that's so important. Um,
And the fascinating thing is
mhm.
that labeling process like cuts the loop of whatever the emotion is. Like, whoo, I'm feeling really anxious. Okay. I remember years ago, I went to a job interview. I was dreadfully nervous for the job interview because I really, really wanted the job, right? And I shook hands with the interviewer and he looks at me, he goes, your hands are sweaty. You must be nervous. And I was like, okay, I have options here. I could die. I could just spontaneously die because I felt like I was just going to die of deep embarrassment. Or I can just say, yeah, I'm really nervous. I really want this job. And it was fascinating because him labeling it, while it made me wildly embarrassed, was actually great modeling for what my job was to do next, which was to acknowledge, yeah, I'm really nervous.
Wow.
And then we ended up having a much better conversation than if I had been spending the job interview trying to pretend that I wasn't nervous. Right. And him
Mm-hmm.
seeing that I was nervous, but refusing to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. That makes it much more awkward to
Yeah,
not acknowledge
exactly.
it. And so I've heard this a couple of times, like anxiousness is also like the similar feeling as like excitement. And that's
Yes.
times when we're feeling anxious, we're actually excited.
It has the
What's your
same
yeah. Mhm,
physiological load.
mhm,
So the story that you tell yourself
yeah,
is the interpretation that your body takes. But actually the physiological load of anxiety and excited are actually pretty identical.
yeah. Because that's the way I've been thinking about it. Whenever if I ever do get anxious, I'm just like, I'm actually really excited for this. Like I've been wanting this. This is something I want to do, and
Yeah.
just change the mindset. So yeah, I think that's awesome. And that just kind of goes back to like being more conscious. Like, well, you can kind of choose when it's anxious. I mean, obviously sometimes you will just feel anxious and
Right.
can't get over that, but you can a lot of times you can choose like, well, I'm just going to choose to feel excited instead of just tell myself the story that I'm anxious. I'm not, I'm worried about it or whatever. So,
Yeah. When
um,
my
so
nephew was 11, he's now in high school and a young man, but when he was 11, he said, "Auntie Carrie, I'm feeling really nervous sighted." I was like, "What's nervous sighted?" And he's like, when you're nervous but you're excited and it's all smushed into a big clump of butterflies in your stomach, that's nervous sighted. And I was like, "Oh, I'm stealing that."
Man, yeah, kids are so insightful with those kinds of things. It's
I've
awesome.
been using nervous sighted with my clients ever since.
Yeah, I mean, there really are like very similar feelings. So, I mean, I can definitely see that, and I love that that story, the nervous sided.
Like
That's
a
great.
clump of butterflies in your stomach.
Oh
Oh,
man. So, do you have a couple kids?
I have one.
Okay. How
Yeah,
old?
she is turning 18. She graduated from high school yesterday.
Oh wow! Congrats.
Woo woo.
That's awesome. So, with you've been like, I'm sure you are like all about like sharing some of this information with your daughter as well.
Yep.
Does
Yep.
she is she interested in it, or is she kind of like rejecting some of it?
It depends on the moment.
Yeah.
Sometimes she's very interested, and sometimes she rolls her eyes and would like me to leave my psychologist hat off.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I kind of get my self-sabotage hat on sometimes with my wife. She's like, "You're being a coach with me right now. Take that off and
Uh-huh.
just be my husband." I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry."
Sorry about that.
Like just
Yep.
kind of get that mind of thinking that way. So yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, I mean, I've really been enjoying our talk.
Yeah.
Been very insightful. I had a thought. It was a while back we talked about this. Like the anxiety and the depression going down through the genes.
Mhm.
Um, have you heard much about like epigenetics?
A little bit.
So I recently read a book from Bruce Lipton, who's like one of the pioneers in epigenetics,
Mhm.
and he talks about how like a lot of like because before epigenetics, we thought like, oh, your genes, you're just kind of stuck within your genes, right? Like you can't do much with it.
We have
Um,
so much more
yeah.
plasticity than we give ourselves
Oh
credit
yeah.
for.
And like a lot of it, like a lot of at least what epigenetics really talks about is just like it's a lot of it is just like your environment and like the foods and like the thoughts and like the beliefs you're putting into
Yep.
yourself is really affecting your cells on a, like a biological level,
Mhm.
which is super fascinating to me and makes me think too like, well, what else is handed down from generation to generation besides genes, right? Usually a lot of times the thought patterns and the things that
Yep.
you do, the things that you eat, the places that you live. And so big way to like start to overcome self-sabotage and kind of get out of those like anxiety points is like, well, noticing maybe what things did I get from my parents or what things did I And like, obviously it's not about like attacking your parents. It's about just identifying, hey, maybe there was something that I learned from them that was not necessarily helpful.
So there's a
Mhm.
fun story. I read this a long time ago, but there was a woman who was making a turkey, and she cut off the end of or it was a ham. She was making a ham and she cut off the end of the ham and threw out part of the ham.
Right.
And she had a new daughter-in-law, and her daughter-in-law said to her, why'd you cut off the end of the ham? And she goes, well, I've always cut off the end of the ham. And then the grandma comes and the mom, so the daughter-in-laws asked the mom, and the mom then asks her mom, she's like, why do we cut off the end of the ham? Right. And the grandma says, oh, my oven used to be really small. So a whole ham didn't fit in my oven. So I cut off the ham. She's like, you cut off the ham? She's like, you have a full-size oven. You're fine. Right?
Yeah.
I think it might have been 4 generations instead of 3, but you get the point. And the
Mhm.
point is that sometimes we're doing something reflexively
Mhm.
that we've always done, that maybe we even saw our moms do, or our dads do, or our grandparents do, or whatever, or it's just been passed down through family lore that this is how you do things, right? And sometimes it's really useful to slow down and stop and to ask the question, why are we doing this? Where did this come from? And most importantly, do I need to choose to, am I going to choose to continue this or choose not to?
Mhm.
And so that notion of cutting off the end of the ham is that exact idea, right? Like, why am I doing this? I'm just doing this. And this is where that conscious versus unconscious comes in, right? Like, I've just been doing it this way just because, or because I learned it when I was 6, or because, everybody in my neighborhood did it this way.
Right.
And then the answer is like, well, are we actually, is that actually still a skillful reaction?
Mhm.
And to ask if that's something that you want to continue or not continue.
Yep. Yeah, that's so important to identify those things. I feel like because there's a lot of patterns in those in our life that are like that, right? We're just like doing something just because that's how we
Yep.
saw someone else do it,
Yep.
and then
Or, again, remember that our brain's bar for efficiency
Mhm.
is, again, that very low bar. What did I do the last time that didn't kill me?
Yep.
And so raising the bar for ourselves of what do I want to do? How do I want to choose to respond, instead of just, oh, well, I've always responded this way, or this is just how we've always done it. And sometimes there's things that you've always done that it's like, yep, check, I want to continue doing that. And then there's other things that you've always done that's like, I think I might have outgrown that response. I want to do something different.
Right. Makes total sense. And so, question here. So, obviously, what you like the efficiency is important as well. But how much is it for like with things like peer pressure, like fitting in with society, like fitting in with your
Huge.
friends, or that's a pretty big drive as well, correct?
That's a very
Mhm.
big instinctual drive, right? Like if you imagine back in using evolutionary biology, if you imagine back to when we were a much more tribal scenario,
Yep.
being out group literally meant that you were going to be by yourself and you were going to starve and die.
Mhm.
So we get very instinctual, ancient reactions to feeling out group.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, that's why peer pressure is so strong, and that's why people have a hard time saying no. Like I know when I stopped drinking, because I've been like alcohol free for about 4 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so like when I stopped drinking, I had people, I think, because I've also noticed when you stop drinking and
Mhm.
your friends start to get uncomfortable with you stopping, because they're like, I think instinctually, like they're like, oh no, we're losing a member of our group, of our tribe, and
Right.
we're not as safe anymore without that person. So they try to pull you back in, right? They're like, come on, just have one drink. What are you
Yep.
doing?
Like you're
Just have a
fine.
drink. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, exactly. I thought that
Well,
was
and it's
Mhm.
interesting to then demonstrate that. And my guess is that some of your friendships probably changed.
Yeah.
And my guess is that some of your friendships just recognize, like, oh, he doesn't drink, but it's fine. He's still him, he's still Tanner. We're still good. And then once that bar was crossed, then it's fine.
Yeah.
Right. And then there might have been some folks who reacted really poorly because maybe they had issues with drinking themselves. This is one of the things that I always see sort of sort out when folks make major changes is, can the friends around them tolerate the change? Sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay.
Yep.
Everything has a beginning and a middle and an end. I think it's crummy when friendships end, but sometimes it's the right thing to do.
Definitely. Yeah, but it could be a hard part definitely of making those changes. Like you think a lot of people just think, oh, just making the change itself is hard, but just seeing what else has happened or what else, is going to change with you, with society, with friends or your family, your interactions, because definitely interactions change a lot when you stop drinking, right? Because it's so
Very
common
much
in
so.
society. So now I have a question. I've seen you a couple of times when you're like explaining something, you're like also doing like a deep breath. So how important is deep breathing and actually getting into your breath? Do you practice that as well with any of your clients or yourself?
Yeah. I talk a lot about getting in your body. And things like a podcast. I love doing podcasts. I talk with my hands, which you've seen the whole time. And I'm aware that I should like be more non-embodied sometimes
No,
when I'm talking on a podcast, because you
the
can just
volume
see
is
little
great.
bits and pieces. But getting in your body gives you really good information, and befriending your body and letting your body befriend your emotions and your emotional regulation is a really lovely thing to do. So I'm a big proponent for my clients of getting grounded, getting into their bodies and understanding different micro expressions in their bodies, right? Like, do they get twinges of stress across their shoulders? Do their jaws get tight? Do all of a sudden they find themselves clenching their hands, right? That's an indication that like, oh, there's something emotional going on. And I can manipulate the emotion by manipulating my physical being, right? So if all of a sudden you're feeling really tense, getting into and like shrugging up your shoulders and then up, back, and down gives you a different sense of emotion. And all you've done is actually just shifted your body, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one of the, it's a powerful tool, is recognizing and acknowledging how things come into play in our bodies, and then using our bodies on purpose to change the pattern.
Yep. That's so important. I think just kind of it's the same kind of like similarity of like being more conscious, being more aware of what you're doing, how you're feeling inside your body. That's so important. Um, so I think we're probably going to be wrapping up this podcast here soon. I always like to ask, for anyone who's out there struggling, like what is like a piece of advice that you'd want them to take away? Like maybe it could be a couple of different things or whatever it may be. Like if it's just like a couple points like that you want them to take away, what is something that they can go away with this and maybe take forward, or that you just want them to keep in mind after listening to this podcast?
I think my big encouragement for people is to be confident that knowing yourself is going to be helpful. And that includes knowing what you're good at and what you're not so good at. And understanding your strengths and weaknesses gives you a tremendous amount of power, and it gives you a tremendous amount of freedom and flexibility. And no one, not anyone is perfect or has it all figured out, right? I joke with my clients all the time that like, I'm a psychologist. I teach this all day. How did I get into this pattern? Oh, because I'm human. Right? So knowing yourself, understanding your tendencies, your patterns, your strengths and weaknesses, oh my gosh, it gives you so much great information, and it gives you so many more options, because almost everything is a skill that you can learn and you can improve on. And so even things that are big weaknesses, you probably have a little bit more agency there than you're giving yourself credit for. And so just really don't be afraid to take a look at who you really are and decide what portions of who you really are you are like good to go on and you feel solid about, and what are the portions that you're like, oh, I could use a little help here.
I love that. Great advice. Thank you so much for just coming on the podcast and sharing your wisdom. And I really enjoyed just talking about, psychology and subconscious mind and just self-sabotage. It was great meeting you and just chatting with you, Carrie. Thank you so much.
It's great to meet you too, Tanner. It's nice to put your face with the name.
Awesome. And then if anyone's interested in reaching out to Carrie, I'll have her links down below.
Great.
So make sure you guys reach out. I think really important part of overcoming self-sabotage is reaching out for help. I know it was a big change for me when I reached out for help from someone. And it's nothing that's embarrassing. It's actually at times it can be empowering to reach out for help, and it can really get you moving forward in life. So you got anything to say about that?
And everybody,
Yep.
everybody has difficulties sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Like, and all of us self-sabotage a little bit
Yep.
because we're human. It's a piece of the experience. So I think
Mhm.
it's really powerful that you're bringing it up, making it clear for people, and giving folks an accessible way to understand the pattern and get right out of it.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And make sure you guys like this, give us a comment, share it around. More people get this information, the better. I know people need it now more than ever. So thanks once again, Carrie. It was great having you on the podcast.
Thanks, Tanner.